America cannot pay its bills. That sentence sounds like a man yelling on cable news at 2 in the afternoon. It sounds like the kind of sentence designed to make people angry before it makes them think. So we need to slow it down immediately, because the lazy version of this argument is wrong, but the sophisticated version is worse. The United States is not a household. It does not have to go find dollars in the couch cushions before it can pay a bill. It issues the currency. It taxes in the currency. It borrows in the currency. It has a central bank attached to the system. It has a treasury market so large and so central that global finance still treats it like the deepest pool of safety on earth. So, no, America is not going to run out of dollars in the way a family runs out of money before rent is due. That is the easy correction. That is what educated people say when they want to sound calm. But then the harder truth walks in. America can create dollars. America can refinance debt. America can clear checks. What America cannot do is keep every political promise, every entitlement formula, every defense posture, every tax preference, every subsidy, every bailout instinct, every emergency spending habit, and every low tax expectation at the same time without changing the value of the money, changing the terms of the promise, or forcing somebody else to absorb the difference. That is the real sentence. America can pay, it cannot fulfill. There is a difference between payment and fulfillment. A retiree can receive a check that still arrives on time, but buys less than the life she was promised. A bondholder can receive every coupon payment exactly on schedule, but in dollars, whose real value has been quietly shaved down. A young worker can keep paying payroll taxes into a program that technically exists, while slowly understanding that the deal offered to his grandparents will not be the deal offered to him. That is not default in the legal sense. That is default in the psychological sense. It is a broken expectation that still clears through the banking system. And this is why the phrase, America cannot pay its bills, is both too dramatic and not dramatic enough. Too dramatic because the Treasury is still the Treasury. The auction calendar still functions. The government can still raise money. Checks still go out. The world still wants dollar collateral. Not dramatic enough because the deeper failure is not that the payment stops. The deeper failure is that the terms of national life get repriced while everyone is told nothing technically failed. As of May 2026, the gross federal debt is just under $39 trillion. That number is so large that the mind almost refuses to process it. 39 trillion becomes atmosphere. It becomes one of those figures people hear, shake their head at, and then mentally file away beside ocean depth and galaxy size. Too large to feel personal, too abstract to change behavior. But the number becomes human when you stop looking at it as a pile of debt and start looking at it as a pile of claims. Claims on future taxes, claims on future inflation, claims on future workers, claims on future retirees, claims on future political fights, claims on the patience of investors who may still love Treasury securities, but may love them more at a higher yield. This is the thing most people miss. The national debt is not just money already spent. It is the formal record of promises that were easier to finance than to settle. That is what a deficit is, emotionally. A deficit is a fight postponed. It is society saying, not today. Do not cut that program today. Do not raise that tax today. Do not disappoint that constituency today. Do not tell voters the full price today. Issue the debt. Sell the bond. Move the argument forward. And for decades, that worked. It worked so well that people mistook delay for wisdom. Rates were low. Global capital wanted safety. The dollar was dominant. The Treasury market had depth. The Federal Reserve could lean into crisis after crisis. Politicians learned that the country could absorb more than the old textbooks suggested. That discovery changed the culture of governance. Once a political class learns that borrowing can hide conflict, borrowing stops feeling like an emergency tool and starts feeling like the normal language of the state. Every hard choice can be refinanced. Every constituency can be partially satisfied. Every crisis can be met with another package. Every tax cut can be scored against future growth. Every spending program can be defended as investment. Every temporary measure can become semi-permanent because nobody wants to be the person who takes it away. Then one day the deficit stops looking like an exception. It becomes the operating model. That is where the United States now sits. CBO projects a federal deficit around $1.9 trillion in fiscal year 2026. Not in a year defined by a global war, not in a year defined by a shutdown of the whole economy, not in a year where Washington can say, this is temporary, this is extraordinary, this is the cost of survival, this is what normal now looks like. That is the problem. A crisis deficit is one thing. A normal deficit is another. In a crisis, the house is on fire and the family borrows because there is no morally serious alternative. A normal deficit is different. A normal deficit means the house has been redesigned so the rent never covers the mortgage, the utilities, the insurance, the repairs, and the old credit card balance from the last emergency. People want to argue about whether the United States is bankrupt. That is the wrong argument. Bankruptcy is too clean. Bankruptcy is a courtroom word. It suggests a moment of recognition, a filing, a judge, a hard line between before and after. Sovereign fiscal stress is messier. It is a long hallway. It is not one door labeled default. It is a series of smaller doors labeled higher taxes, lower benefits, weaker money, higher yields, reduced public investment, financial repression, and less trust. The country can walk that hallway for a very long time. That is what makes it so dangerous. If collapse came quickly, people would be forced to understand it. But managed erosion is easier to deny. The check comes, the benefit arrives, the bond pays, the salary increases, the government opens, the school operates, the road is patched. Everything still exists, only the deal is thinner. That is the human version of the math. Nobody wakes up and says, "Today I experienced sovereign fiscal deterioration." They say groceries are high, rent is insane, my refund was smaller, my parents are nervous about Medicare, my bond fund did not feel safe, my mortgage rate changed my life, my city cannot fix anything, my paycheck is bigger but not better, my government spends trillions and still somehow feels broke. That is what fiscal arithmetic feels like when it leaves the spreadsheet. The bill's clear, the promise does not. And once you understand that distinction, the whole country starts to look different, not poorer in a simple sense. More claimed, more pre-spent, more mortgaged, like a beautiful house where every room is still lit, but every square foot already has a lien attached to it. The public sees the lights, the bond market sees the liens. That is the opening. The next mistake is thinking the debt is one giant number sitting still. It is not sitting still. It is moving through time. A Treasury bill maturing in 4 weeks is not the same financial creature as a 30-year bond. They both count as federal debt, but they behave differently. One comes due almost immediately. The other sits in the wall for a generation. One forces the government back into the market again and again. The other locks in a rate, for better or worse, across a much longer period. So when people say the national debt is almost $39 trillion, they're giving you the headline, not the mechanism. The mechanism is maturity. The mechanism is rollover. The mechanism is the rate at which yesterday's debt becomes tomorrow's auction. This is where the story becomes more intimate, because every borrower understands this if you bring it down to the household level for just a second. A person with a fixed-rate mortgage at 3% feels like a genius when rates go to 7%. A person with floating-rate debt feels the water rise immediately. Same amount of debt. Totally different life. The United States is not a household, but the rollover logic still matters. Old debt does not stay old forever. It matures. It gets refinanced. And when it gets refinanced, it meets the market as it exists now, not as it existed when the original borrowing happened. That is why the post-2008 world was so seductive. Money was cheap for so long that cheap money started to feel like gravity. The Federal Reserve held rates near zero. Global savings flowed into safe assets. Banks needed high-quality collateral. Foreign central banks wanted reserves. Pension funds needed duration. Insurance companies needed predictable instruments. Treasuries became the sacred furniture of the global financial house. And because the market was so deep and rates were so low, Washington learned a dangerous lesson. You can add debt without feeling the full cost right away. That is the most politically addictive thing in the world. A cost that does not hurt immediately. A tax increase hurts now. A spending cut hurts now. A benefit reform hurts now. A bond issuance hurts later, and sometimes the later cost is hidden under so much market demand that nobody has to explain it to voters. Debt became the painkiller that allowed the political body to keep moving even while the injury got worse. Then rates rose. Not to some absurd ancient level, not to 1980s levels. They just stopped being near zero. That was enough. When the debt stock is small, rate changes are manageable. When the debt stock is enormous, rate changes become architecture. A few percentage points can move from financial detail to fiscal destiny. This is the part that people who only stare at the gross debt number miss. The problem is not simply that the United States owes a lot. The problem is that it owes a lot in a world where the cost of refinancing that lot is no longer safely buried near zero. Interest is becoming a federal program. Sit with that sentence because it is the most honest way to say it. Net interest is not a school. It is not a road. It is not an aircraft carrier. It is not a hospital. It is not a benefit check to a grandmother. It is not an inspector. It is not a scientist. It is not a border agent. It is not a grant. It is not a space launch. It is the price of past decisions meeting present rates. And unlike almost every other line item, interest has a seniority that politics cannot casually ignore. You can debate how much to spend on a program. You can restructure an agency. You can postpone a bridge. You can cut a grant. You can delay a procurement. But the bondholder exists inside the funding mechanism itself. The bondholder gets paid because the next auction depends on the market believing the previous promise was real. That is the quiet hierarchy of the state. People do not like that hierarchy. They want democracy to sit above finance, and morally, emotionally, maybe it should. But operationally, if the state relies on borrowing, then the creditor is inside the room even when nobody invited him to the podium. Treasury knows this better than anyone. That is why Treasury speaks in calm, dry, controlled language. It announces borrowing estimates. It manages refunding schedules. It tells the market what supply is coming. It tries to be regular and predictable, because predictability is a kind of fiscal medication. In May 2026, Treasury projected hundreds of billions of dollars in privately held net marketable borrowing across the second and third quarters. These numbers do not sound dramatic when spoken in Treasury language. That is the point. Sovereigns use dry language because dry language keeps the ritual intact. But underneath the language, the mechanism is simple. The government needs cash, so it sells claims on the future. Investors buy those claims, but the price is not fixed by patriotism. It is fixed by demand, inflation expectations, term premium, growth expectations, central bank credibility, regulatory structure, and the market's confidence that the debt will remain liquid, safe, and worth holding. If investors want more yield, the future gets more expensive. If investors prefer shorter maturities, rollover risk rises. If the government issues more bills, it may lower near-term interest cost, but increase exposure to constant refinancing. If it issues more long bonds, it locks in funding but asks the market to absorb more duration. There is no free corner of the chessboard. That is why debt is a calendar. Every maturity date is a future conversation with the market. Every auction is a small referendum on the price of American credibility. Most of those referendums pass without drama. That is why the system feels stable. But stability in sovereign debt markets is not the absence of risk. It is the continuous, successful renewal of trust. That trust is astonishingly powerful. It is also not infinite. Treasuries are not just government I owe us. They are the floorboards of global finance. They sit in bank balance sheets, money market funds, pension portfolios, insurance books, foreign reserve accounts, collateral chains, derivatives, margin systems, and the mental model of what risk-free means. This is what gives the United States enormous privilege. It is also what makes the problem systemic. If the risk-free asset begins to demand a larger risk premium, everything else must reprice around it. Mortgages, corporate bonds, municipal debt, private credit, equity valuations, venture deals, real estate cap rates, bank securities portfolios, pension assumptions, insurance reserves. Everything that used Treasury yields as the base of the tower has to look down and ask whether the floor moved. That is not a default story. That is a repricing story. America's debt problem does not have to announce itself as an auction failure. It can announce itself as permanently higher rates across the economy. It can announce itself as lower stock multiples. It can announce itself as housing affordability collapsing for ordinary families. It can announce itself as federal interest costs, crowding out the very public investments that might have improved growth. This is how the math becomes social. The Treasury curve moves, and a young couple loses the house. The deficit grows, and a city cannot get infrastructure money. The interest line expands, and the discretionary state gets squeezed. The bond market reprices, and every business plan built on cheap capital suddenly looks like fiction. People think debt is abstract until it changes the monthly payment. That is why this section matters. The national debt is not one frozen number. It is a schedule of future tests. Each refinancing asks the same question in a slightly different market mood. What does the world require to keep funding the American promise? For a long time, the answer was not much. The dollar is king, treasuries are safe, and America always pays. The new answer may still be, yes, America pays. But at what rate? That is where the future lives. The third mistake is thinking this is mainly about waste. Waste exists. Of course it exists. Any large institution produces waste. A university can spend 6 months buying a printer. A corporation can have 12 vice presidents approving a dashboard nobody reads. A hospital can charge numbers that feel like they came from a hallucination. Government can do all of that at national scale, but waste is not the core math. That sentence is important because waste is the emotionally comfortable villain. If the problem is waste, then the promises can remain untouched. We just find the bad people, cancel the ridiculous contracts, audit the agencies, fire the consultants, sell the empty buildings, and everything works again. That story feels good because it lets voters keep the fantasy that the country can fund everything they like if only somebody would stop stealing from the drawer. The drawer is not big enough. The big promises are the math. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, interest, expenditures, disaster response, veterans care, farm support, student loan programs, housing support, infrastructure, federal payrolls, research funding, border enforcement, industrial policy, bank rescue capacity, pandemic-style emergency capacity, the old age state, the medical state, the security state, the debt service state. That is not a small pile of waste. That is the operating system of the country. This is where the conversation gets painful, because the federal budget is not mostly a list of things nobody wants. It is a list of things somebody has enough power to protect. Every major line item has a constituency. Every constituency has a moral story. Every moral story has numbers. Every number has lobbyists, voters, lawyers, beneficiaries, contractors, donors, and institutions wrapped around it. The deficit is not one villain. It is too many sacred claims sharing one revenue base. Americans want old age security. They want advanced medical care. They want global military reach. They want low taxes. They want disaster rescue. They want farm support. They want cheap mortgages. They want student relief when the system gets too heavy. They want border security. They want scientific leadership. They want roads, airports, chips, energy, intelligence, space, cyber, veterans programs, and a central bank that protects asset markets when panic arrives. All of that may be individually defensible. That is the nightmare. The problem is not that every claim is stupid. The problem is that many claims are reasonable in isolation and impossible in combination. That is how mature states get trapped. Not through one insane decision, but through 1,000 defensible commitments that compound into an impossible whole. Take Social Security. It is one of the most emotionally powerful programs in American life because it does not feel like welfare to most recipients. It feels earned. People worked, paid payroll taxes, watched the deduction come out of every check, and were told that the system would be there when they aged into it. So when analysts say the formula has to change, many citizens do not hear actuarial adjustment. They hear theft. They hear, I paid in, and now you are moving the target. And emotionally, that reaction is understandable. But the program is not a literal individual savings account. It is a pay-as-you-go social contract with trust fund accounting layered on top. Current workers support current retirees. Trust fund securities represent claims on the Treasury. The system depends on demographics, wages, payroll tax revenue, benefit formulas, life expectancy, and politics. Demographics are not being polite. The worker-to-retiree ratio is not what it was when the system was younger. People live longer. The baby boom generation moved into retirement. Birth rates are lower. Medical costs have their own gravitational field. Wage distribution affects payroll tax revenue. And the political system has spent decades treating gradual adjustment as optional because the trust fund date was always far enough away to be someone else's problem. Now the date is no longer far away. The trustees project the old age and survivors' insurance reserves to be depleted in 2033 under current law assumptions. That does not mean Social Security disappears. It means the dedicated financing structure cannot pay full scheduled benefits without a change. That sentence sounds technical. It is actually explosive, because every fix is somebody's loss. Raise payroll taxes and workers' pay, raise the taxable wage cap and higher earners' pay, raise the retirement age and people with harder bodies and shorter life expectancy pay, trim benefits and retirees' pay, means test benefits, and the political identity of the program changes, borrow more and future taxpayers pay, inflate and people holding cash or fixed payments pay. There is no painless reform. There are only reforms whose pain can be narrated better. Medicare is even more complicated because healthcare is not a normal market. The phrase cut Medicare sounds like a spreadsheet line until it becomes someone's hospital stay, someone's chemotherapy, someone's surgery, someone's father needing skilled nursing, someone's mother being told what is covered and what is not. You are not just cutting spending. You are entering the most emotionally loaded part of family life and trying to turn it into a reimbursement formula. That is why the medical state is so hard to control. People want cost discipline in the abstract and maximum care in the moment. They want government to stop overpaying, but they do not want their hospital to close. They want drug prices lower, but they want innovation. They want less bureaucracy, but also oversight. They want no waste, but every denial of coverage becomes a moral injury. So the system expands. Then defense. Defense is another sacred category. It is not just military spending. It is jobs, bases, contractors, congressional districts, supply chains, weapons platforms, research laboratories, shipyards, aerospace clusters, intelligence networks, and the psychological image of America as a country that can project power everywhere. Cutting defense is never just cutting defense. It is changing America's posture in the world and redistributing pain through local economies that have been built around federal money. Then tax expenditures. This is where people get especially quiet. The government does not only spend by writing checks, it also spends by not collecting revenue it otherwise could collect. Deductions, exclusions, credits, preferential treatment, special rules. Some are good policy, some are political favors wearing policy clothing. But all of them are claims on the revenue base. A tax break feels less like spending because no check is written. That is why it is so politically useful. People who would scream about a subsidy often defend the same fiscal effect if it shows up as a deduction. This is why balancing the budget is not a math puzzle in the ordinary sense. The arithmetic is easy compared with the politics. You can make tables all day, raise this, cut that, bend this curve, freeze that program, change this formula. The spreadsheet will obey, the country will not. The federal budget is a map of organized power. The deficit is what happens when those organized powers are strong enough to preserve their claims, but not honest enough to fund them fully. That is the raw truth. Too many promises have become sacred. Too few costs are allowed to become visible. So the government borrows. Borrowing becomes the neutral zone where incompatible desires can coexist for another year. The retiree gets the check. The taxpayer avoids the full bill. The contractor gets the payment. The hospital gets reimbursed. The voter gets the illusion of solvency. The Treasury market receives another issuance. The fight moves forward. Debt is refinanced disagreement. That phrase matters because it explains why the debt keeps growing even when everyone claims to hate it. They hate the number. They love the promises that produce it. They hate the deficit. They love the tax code, the benefits, the contracts, the rescues, the military posture, and the crisis response capacity that keep creating it. A person can hate smoke and still refuse to put out the fire if the fire is keeping his house warm. That is the United States budget. And this is why the cleanest fiscal analysis is also the most socially uncomfortable. America does not merely have a spending problem or a revenue problem. It has a promise problem. The promises do not fit inside the financing model. Until that is admitted, every debate becomes theater. A country that cannot solve a fiscal problem openly will solve it indirectly. That is not conspiracy. That is systems behavior. When a direct fix is too painful, the adjustment finds side doors. If Congress cannot cut enough, tax enough, grow enough, or reform enough, the system begins to search for channels that do not require one clean public confession. Inflation is one channel, financial repression is another, regulatory absorption is another, benefit formula changes are another, bracket creep is another, underinvestment is another, and time is the greatest channel of all, because time lets every generation pretend the invoice belongs to the next one. This is where people make the mistake of focusing only on default. They ask, will America default? The more useful question is, how can America avoid default while still making somebody pay? That is the real sovereign question. The state has many tools before legal default. It can pay you back in dollars that buy less. It can change tax treatment. It can change the rules that govern institutional demand for government securities. It can alter benefit formulas. It can raise taxes slowly enough that each increase looks manageable. It can allow inflation to run slightly above the old expectation. It can encourage banks, pensions, insurers, and money market structures to absorb more government paper. It can use central bank emergency facilities during stress. It can make Treasury collateral even more embedded in the financial plumbing. The promise changes before the payment stops. Inflation is the easiest one to understand and the hardest one to talk about honestly. People experience inflation as prices rising. But fiscally, inflation is also a transfer. If the government owes fixed nominal dollars and the value of those dollars declines, the government repays in form while reducing the real burden in substance. Nobody has to vote on that in a clean sentence. Nobody stands up and says, I propose that we reduce the real value of fixed claims by allowing the purchasing power of the dollar to erode. That would sound insane. Instead, the adjustment arrives through the price level. A little hotter inflation here, a little slower disinflation there, a little more tolerance because the alternative is recession, a little more patience because unemployment matters, a little more ambiguity because supply shocks are complicated, and then time does the work. Inflation does not have to become cartoon inflation to matter. People talk as if the only inflation worth discussing is wheelbarrows and collapsed currencies. That is unserious. 3% instead of 2% compounded over years matters. 4% instead of 2% matters even more. Small differences in inflation, sustained long enough, are not small. They are slow reallocations of wealth. A little inflation is a file on metal. You still have the bar. It is just thinner. Then there is financial repression, though the phrase sounds too dramatic for polite rooms. Strip away the drama, and it means this. The state creates rules, incentives, and institutional structures that sustain demand for its debt. Sometimes it yields lower than a fully unconstrained market might demand. Banks need high-quality liquid assets. Treasuries qualify. Pension funds need long-duration assets. Treasuries provide duration. Money market funds live in bills. Insurance companies manage portfolios around safe assets. Foreign central banks hold reserves. Regulatory systems treat sovereign debt as foundational. Repo markets use treasuries as collateral. Derivatives markets depend on treasury liquidity. The entire architecture pushes institutions toward the paper the government needs to sell. This is brilliant statecraft. It is also a trap. Once government debt becomes financial infrastructure, the government can fund itself more easily, but the financial system becomes more tightly tied to the government's fiscal condition. The pipes and the public balance sheet become part of one machine. That is why Treasury debt is not just an investment, it is plumbing. If the plumbing is trusted, everything flows. If the plumbing becomes questionable, the whole building notices, not because every pipe bursts, but because water pressure changes everywhere. Funding markets get more fragile. Banks become more rate sensitive. Bond funds behave strangely. Long duration assets wobble. Collateral haircuts matter. Liquidity becomes conditional. This is what makes the American fiscal problem so subtle. It is not just about Washington overspending. It is about the most important collateral market in the world being asked to carry more and more political weight. The state does not have to say, we are in trouble. The term premium can say it, mortgage rates can say it, the yield curve can say it, failed political negotiations can say it, more frequent debt ceiling fights can say it, more nervous Treasury refunding press conferences can say it, more central bank attention to market functioning can say it. Markets often speak before politicians do. Now, to be fair, the United States has enormous capacity. This has to be said because doom is a lazy drug. The U.S. economy is huge. Its tax base is deep. Its institutions, despite every flaw, remain stronger than most alternatives. The dollar system still matters. The military still matters. Technology leadership still matters. Energy capacity still matters. The Treasury market still has unmatched depth. That is why simple collapse predictions are usually wrong. They underestimate the machine, but the complacent people make the opposite mistake. They understand the machine's strength, then confuse strength with immunity. A strong machine can run under strain for a long time. That does not mean the strain is imaginary. It means the strain gets distributed. That is the key. Fiscal stress in a country like the United States does not necessarily show up as an obvious national failure. It shows up as distribution. Who gets diluted? Who gets taxed? Who gets squeezed? Who gets inflated away? Who gets lower real benefits? Who gets lower real returns? Who gets told that this is normal? The answer will not be everyone equally. Older retirees may be protected more than younger workers. Homeowners may be protected more than renters. Asset owners may be rescued more than wage earners. Regulated institutions may be pressured more than voters realize. High earners may pay more, but also have more tools to adapt. Lower income households may receive transfers, but lose purchasing power through prices. The middle class may be squeezed from both sides because it is visible enough to tax and not powerful enough to fully protect. This is where fiscal policy becomes class structure. Do not look only for a budget crisis. Look for a social sorting mechanism. The deficit is not just an accounting gap. It is a future contest over who absorbs the mismatch between promises and resources. That contest will often be hidden inside technical language. Cost of living adjustment, premium adjustment, means test, tax expenditure reform, liquidity coverage, supplementary leverage ratio, treasury market resilience, debt management strategy, auction size, term premium, real yield, primary dealer capacity, Social Security solvency, Medicare trust fund. These sound like bureaucratic phrases. Many are actually battlefields. The public hears paperwork. The system hears allocation. That is why the promise can change without people noticing it first. Nobody wakes up to a headline that says, "Your future has been repriced." Instead, they live through 1,000 small revisions. The benefit is still there, but less generous. The tax rate is still familiar, but the deduction is gone. The dollar is still the dollar, but the basket costs more. The bond still pays, but the real return disappoints. The government still functions, but the level of service feels degraded. The economy still grows, but the surplus belongs to fewer people. The state survives. The promise changes. That is the core of this section. Default is not the only exit. It is not even the most likely one. The more likely exit is a long repricing of reality, conducted through inflation, taxes, formulas, rules, yields, and institutional pressure. The terrifying thing is that almost all of it can happen while the checks clear on time. So where does this end? Probably not with one cinematic day. That is the answer people dislike because it does not give them a scene. People want a crash. They want a failed auction, a president at a podium, traders shouting, emergency meetings, a headline that says the old era is over. Human beings like endings that look like endings. Fiscal deterioration usually does not respect that desire. It is more likely to arrive as a long corridor of worsening trade-offs. Some years feel fine, some years feel tense. Some inflation reports scare people. Some Treasury auctions get watched a little more closely. Some Congresses pretend to reform things. Some presidents claim growth will solve it. Some investors demand more yield. Some households feel the squeeze before the official language admits the squeeze exists. And the whole thing keeps going, until it goes at a worse price. That is the sovereign debt story in its most human form. Things continue, but the cost of continuation rises. The family keeps the house, but the credit card balance grows. The company keeps operating, but more cash flow goes to interest. The government keeps paying, but more of the budget becomes past tense money. Past tense money is money spent on yesterday. Interest is past tense money. It may be necessary, it may be legally sacred, but it does not build tomorrow by itself. If too much of the budget becomes past tense money, the future starts shrinking even while the economy continues to function. That is what less future means. Less fiscal room for infrastructure, less room for scientific investment, less room for defense modernization without higher taxes, less room for emergency response without more borrowing, less room to protect retirees without squeezing workers, less room to reduce taxes without increasing deficits, less room for public imagination. A society can still be rich and feel trapped if too much of its future income is already claimed. That is America now. Rich, powerful, innovative, militarily dominant, technologically aggressive, still globally central, and yet increasingly overclaimed. The country is not poor. It is pre-spent. This is why the fiscal issue bleeds into culture. People often separate economics from mood, but they are connected. A budget that never balances eventually becomes a country that does not trust itself. Every group believes another group is taking too much. The young believe the old consume the deal. The old believe the young do not respect the system they built. Taxpayers believe beneficiaries are exploiting them. Beneficiaries believe elites are protecting themselves. Bondholders want discipline. Politicians want applause. Voters want honesty from everyone except the person who would reduce their own claim. That is how a ledger becomes resentment. When there is surplus, politics can be generous. When the surplus is gone, politics becomes forensic. Everyone starts asking who stole the future. Sometimes they find genuine theft. Often they find something more uncomfortable. The future was not stolen by one person. It was allocated away through a long series of legal, popular, defensible promises. The future was spent in public. That sentence is brutal because it removes the comfort of a single villain. It was not one party, one president, one agency, one war, one tax cut, one benefit program, one crisis, one lobby. Those things matter, but they are pieces. The deeper structure is that the American political system learned to promise more than it was willing to price. And now the pricing is returning. It may return through taxes. It may return through inflation. It may return through lower real benefits. It may return through higher interest costs. It may return through worse public services. It may return through more volatile markets. It may return through a generation of young workers who feel that the ladder is still visible, but the rungs are farther apart. That last point matters. Fiscal decline is not just about bond math. It is about whether people believe effort still connects to reward. If housing is expensive, taxes rise, benefits feel uncertain, inflation eats wages, public services disappoint, and politics feels like a fight among already protected groups, then the legitimacy of the system changes. People stop believing the country is a machine for upward movement. They start believing it is a machine for claim protection. That is a dangerous psychological shift. The bond market can survive a lot. Democracy may be less patient. This is why I do not like the phrase debt crisis by itself. It narrows the issue. Debt is the instrument. The crisis is trust. Trust that the promise means what it says. Trust that money will hold value. Trust that work will be rewarded. Trust that taxes buy something. Trust that old people will not be abandoned. Trust that young people will not be cannibalized. Trust that the state can choose. Trust that the bond market is not quietly becoming the only adult in the room. When that trust weakens, every fiscal debate becomes moral combat. A benefits reform becomes a betrayal. A tax increase becomes confiscation. A spending cut becomes cruelty. A bond market warning becomes elite blackmail. An inflation warning becomes partisan propaganda. The facts do not disappear. They just lose authority. That is what happens when arithmetic is delayed too long. Arithmetic eventually returns as anger. So no, America is probably not going broke like a household. That analogy is too small. America is doing something more complex. It is using the privileges of monetary sovereignty, reserve currency status, institutional depth, and market centrality to keep the payment system intact, while the real content of its promises becomes less stable. The checks will clear. The promise will not remain untouched. That is the conclusion. And it is not a call for panic. Panic is useless. It is a call for adult language. The country has to stop pretending that the budget is a moral wish list plus a bond market that never asks questions. It has to stop treating debt as an abstraction and inflation as an accident and interest as a footnote. It has to stop pretending that every promise is sacred and every cost can be hidden. The hard truth is that a country can be powerful and still be fiscally dishonest. It can be rich and still be overpromised. It can pay every bill and still disappoint every generation that misunderstood what payment meant. Solvency is not prosperity. Liquidity is not affordability. Payment is not fulfillment. That is the math.